It is 6 o'clock in the morning at the Palace of Versailles, and somewhere deep inside its gilded corridors, a man is still asleep, but not for long because 49 people are already awake and thinking about him. The candles have been lit, the fires have been set, the water has been warmed to a precise and particular temperature that has been agreed upon, discussed and perfected over years of careful refinement. Outside the royal bedchamber, in the dim and tapestried antechamber that smells of beeswax and cold stone and the faint perfume of men who have been standing still for too long, the first wave of courtiers has already assembled. They are not restless. They do not pace. They stand the way men stand when they believe, sincerely and completely, that this waiting, this stillness, this proximity to a sleeping king, is the greatest thing they will ever do with their lives. Go ahead and settle in now, pull whatever is warm a little closer, because what you are about to understand is stranger and more human than almost anything history has left us. Louis XIV, King of France, ruler of the most powerful nation on earth, did not own his mornings. He had not owned them since he was a child. From the moment the designated first gentleman of the bedchamber spoke the words, "Sire, it is time," the day began not as a private act of waking but as a public performance of existing, witnessed and attended and recorded by men whose entire purpose, whose rank and relevance and reason for being in this palace at all, depended entirely on their right to be present in this room while a king opened his eyes. There was an order to it. There was always an order to it. The first gentleman entered first. Then came the Grand Chamberlain. Then the princes of the blood, if they were present, which they tried very hard always to be, because missing the morning ritual meant missing the moment when Louis might glance in your direction, and a glance from Louis was worth more than land. It was worth more than gold. A glance from the Sun King meant you were seen, which at Versailles was the only currency that truly mattered. Louis would lie there in the great carved bed behind its velvet curtains, and the curtains would be drawn back, not by him, never by him, and he would look out at the assembled faces of men who had risen before dawn, dressed in their finest, and travelled through cold corridors for the privilege of watching him be horizontal, and he had done this every single morning for decades, not because he was cruel, not because he was thoughtless, but because this was the shape of the world he had built, carefully and deliberately, stone by stone, ritual by ritual, a world in which the King of France was not a person who woke up, but a sun that rose, and the rising had to be witnessed, or it had not truly happened at all. Outside the tall windows, the gardens of Versailles were still dark, still quiet, still waiting. The way everything at Versailles was always waiting for him. The curtains have been drawn back now, and Louis is awake, and the room holds its breath. He does not reach for anything. He does not swing his legs over the side of the bed with the sleepy, graceless momentum of an ordinary man. There is no yawning, or if there is, it is absorbed quietly into the ceremony, folded away like a crease in silk. Instead, he waits, not passively, not impatiently, but with the particular stillness of a man who has never once in his adult life had to reach for something that was not already being handed to him. He waits because waiting is correct. Waiting is, in fact, the most powerful thing he can do, because the moment Louis XIV waits, 49 people move. The first thing that happens is the holy water, a small golden vessel presented by a designated nobleman whose family has held this precise honor for generations, passed down like a title, like a name, like a wound. Louis dips his fingers. He makes the sign of the cross. This takes perhaps 4 seconds, and it is watched with the reverence of a congregation witnessing something sacred, because at Versailles it is. Then comes the shirt. This is the moment that visitors, ambassadors, foreign dignitaries who have somehow found themselves inside this strange and beautiful machine struggle most to understand. The shirt, clean, white, warmed near the fire, is not simply handed to the king. It passes through hands, specifically. It passes through hands of whoever holds the highest rank in the room at that precise moment, because rank determined everything at Versailles. determined it with a mathematical precision that would make a clockmaker weep with admiration. If a prince of the blood entered the room just as a lesser duke was reaching for the shirt was silently, smoothly redirected. The duke stepped back, the prince stepped forward. Louis watched this happen, sometimes with an expression that told you nothing at all. Think for a moment about your own morning, the particular privacy of it, the smallness and the quiet of simply being a body that is waking up, ungraceful and unhurried and entirely your own. There is something in that, something so ordinary it is almost invisible, that Louis XIV had not experienced since childhood, and perhaps not even then. He did not dress himself. His stockings were rolled onto his legs by a kneeling man. His shoes were placed onto his feet by another. The coat, the waistcoat, every button and buckle and ribbon was attended to by a specific perso, name with a specific role, and those roles had names, formal Latin names recorded in documents, because everything at Versailles had a name and a document and a precedent, going back further than anyone could comfortably remember, and through all of it, Louis remained extraordinarily, almost supernaturally, composed. No flinching from cold hands, no impatience at the elaborate slowness of it all. He had understood something very early, something that would take the men around him entire lifetimes to grasp, that the ritual was not something done to him. The ritual was him, and the men in that room smoothing his sleeves, straightening his cuffs, stepping back to admire the king they had collectively constructed from linen and candlelight, felt, each of them, that they had participated in something that mattered, something real, something worth the cold corridors and the early rising and the decades of waiting in rooms that smelled of other people's importance. It began, quietly and without grandeur, as a hunting lodge, a small brick and timber place in the forests outside Paris, where Louis XIII, the father, came to be alone. It was modest by royal standards. It was, by the standards of what it would become, almost embarrassingly small, a place for mud on boots and fires kept low and the particular silence of a man who needed, occasionally, to be somewhere that did not require him to be a king. Louis XIII loved it precisely because it asked nothing of him. He could breathe there, he could disappear there, which for a king is perhaps the most extraordinary luxury of all. His son looked at that small and breathing place and decided to bury it, not literally. Louis XIV did not tear down his father's lodge. He folded it inside something so enormous, so relentlessly magnificent, that it became a kind of ghost at the center of a cathedral built to its own memory. The new verse. Owls rose around the old one, layer by layer, decade by decade, 30,000 workers at its peak, men who broke their bodies in its marshes and its scaffolding and its endless hungry stone. They built fountains that required an entire river to be redirected. They planted forests fully grown, transported from other parts of France because Louis could not wait for trees. They constructed a hall of mirrors so long and so luminous that walking its length at night, by candlelight, with the reflections multiplying around you into an infinite corridor of flame, you could momentarily forget that you were a human being standing in a building and begin to suspect you had wandered into the inside of a dream. Settle gently into wherever you are right now, because this next part deserves your stillness. Louis moved the entire French court to Versailles in 1682. This was not an invitation. It was, in the most elegantly constructed way possible, a command. The nobility of France, the dukes and the princes and the ancient families whose names were older than the country itself, were expected to be present, consistently, visibly. Attendance at Versailles was not merely encouraged. Absence from Versailles was noticed, and when Louis noticed your absence, he said nothing. He simply, quietly remembered it. And in a kingdom where the king's memory was the only law that truly mattered, being forgotten was indistinguishable from being destroyed. So they came, and they stayed, and they built their lives inside his orbit, the way planets have no choice but to circle a star. They gave up their estates, their regional power, their old and root-bound independence for apartments at Versailles that were sometimes barely larger than the antechambers they had left behind. They traded substance for proximity. They traded everything real for the chance to stand in a room where Louis XIV caught if the light was right and the moment was correct. Look at them. What Louis had built beneath all the marble and the gilding and the fountains that exhausted an entire river was a mechanism of control so sophisticated it barely needed to declare itself. He had not imprisoned the nobility, he had simply made his presence the most desirable place in France to be, and then made absence from it feel like disappearing, and in the centre of all of it, surrounded always, attended always, watched and witnessed and never for a single unscheduled moment left entirely alone. Louis XIV moved through his palace like a son that had forgotten what darkness felt like. At some point in the late morning, after the dressing and the praying and the brief, carefully managed meeting with his closest advisers, Louis XIV sat down to eat, and the audience took their places. This was called the petit couvert on the quieter days, when only a small constellation of attendants surrounded the table, or the grand couvert on the formal occasions when the theatre expanded to include hundreds of observers, standing in respectful, attentive silence while the King of France chewed. Both had rules, both had positions, assigned and memorized and defended with the quiet ferocity that Versailles reserved for all its most important competitions. Who stood where? Who was permitted to speak? Who held the napkin? Who presented the cup? Every gesture in that dining room had a name and a custodian, and the custodian took their responsibilities with a seriousness that would not have been out of place on a battlefield. Louis almost always ate alone. That sentence requires a moment to settle. In a room that was never empty, attended by servants and nobles and officials whose entire purpose was to be present, surrounded by the low murmur of a court that breathed and shifted and watched his every movement. Louis ate alone. There was no companion across the table, no quiet conversation over soup, no one to pass the bread with the careless intimacy of people who share meals because they share lives. The table was set for one, and it was set magnificently, and he sat at it the way a painting sits inside a frame, perfectly composed, perfectly contained, and separated from the world by something invisible but absolute. The food itself was extraordinary, at least in theory. Course after course arrived from kitchens that were so far from the royal dining room that the journey alone guaranteed everything would arrive, at a temperature well below the intention. The corridors of Versailles were not short. The ceremony of presentation was not quick. By the time the roasted meats and the elaborate sauces and the sculptured pastries completed their long procession through the palace, they had cooled to something closer to a memory of warmth than warmth itself. Louis ate cold food almost always, and had eaten cold food for most of his adult life, and there is no record of him ever complaining about this particular detail, which is either a testament to his extraordinary self-discipline or evidence that he had simply never known anything different. He ate a great deal by most accounts. The royal appetite was famous, almost legendary. Contemporaries recorded meals of staggering proportion, course after course, consumed with a steady, unhurried thoroughness that apparently impressed even those accustomed to watching it. There is something quietly fascinating about this. The man who controlled every variable of his existence, who had constructed an entire civilization of ritual around the management of perception, who was never seen to be anything other than composed and deliberate and entirely in command. This same man, when faced with food, simply and humanly ate. And the watchers were touched. They stood in their assigned positions along the walls and near the doors, noblemen and officials, and visiting dignitaries, who had requested and been granted the extraordinary privilege of observing the king's meal, and they watched with an attention that transformed an ordinary act of eating into something ceremonial, something significant, something that would be described in letters home with the trembling excitement of people who had witnessed a miracle. A man named Philippe, who served as an under-steward in those years and kept a private diary that survived him by 3 centuries, wrote only this about the experience of watching Louis eat. He was utterly alone in a room full of love, and he seemed to know it, and he never looked up. There was a countess, her name was Adelaide, and she had been born in a chateau in Burgundy that her family had owned for 200 years. It was not a small place. It sat on a hill above a river that turned gold in the late afternoon, and it had gardens that her grandmother had planted by hand, and cellars full of wine that tasted like the specific earth of that specific hillside and nothing else on earth. There were rooms in that chateau that Adelaide had known since childhood, rooms that smelled of old wood and lavender, and the particular dusty warmth of places that have been loved for generations. She knew which stair creaked. She knew where the light fell in October. She knew the names of the farmers who worked the land below, and they knew hers. And there was a kind of dignity in that knowing, quiet and unspectacular, and as solid as the stone the house was built from. She gave it all up to live in 3 rooms at Versailles. The rooms were smaller than the entrance hall of her chateau. The walls were beautiful. Everything at Versailles was beautiful. That was rather the point. But the beauty was impersonal, curated, identical to the beauty on either side of her and above her and below her, a beauty that belonged to the palace rather than to anyone who lived inside it. She shared a fireplace that was never quite warm enough with the apartments on either side. She could hear through walls that were thinner than they appeared the conversations and arguments and occasional weeping of people she was required to treat in public with elaborate and ceremonious respect. And she stayed. She stayed because leaving meant disappearing, and disappearing at Versailles was a kind of social death, so complete it might as well have been the other kind. This was Louis's most elegant invention, not the fountains, not the hall of mirrors, not the gardens that required an army of men to maintain their geometric perfection. His greatest invention was this. He had made proximity to himself the sole measure of a person's worth, and then he had made that proximity available only to those who gave up everything that had previously made them worth something. It was a trade so asymmetrical it should have been obvious, and yet the nobility of France made it, generation after generation, with an enthusiasm that never entirely dimmed. They competed, these displaced aristocrats, with a ferocity that would have seemed extraordinary in any other context, for the right to perform small services, the right to hand Louis his gloves, the right to precede him through a doorway, or to follow him, or to stand in a particular position relative to his body during the evening promenade. These distinctions were not trivial to them, they were everything. A man who had surrendered his ancestral lands and his regional authority and his genuine independence would defend his right to hand the king his hat with a passion that his grandfather had reserved for defending actual territory, because the hat was territory now. Press it, incense was land. A position near the king's left shoulder at the evening entertainment was worth more, in the currency Versailles had invented, than the 200-year-old chateau in Burgundy with the river that turned gold in the afternoon. Adelaide knew this. She was not a foolish woman. On certain evenings when the court had retired and her 3 small rooms held only herself and the inadequate fire and the sounds of her neighbours through the walls, she knew it completely and clearly, the way you know things in the dark that you cannot quite hold on to in the daylight. And in the morning she dressed carefully and arranged her face and walked out into the corridors of Versailles with the expression of a woman who had chosen exactly this and would choose it again, not the measured ceremonial movement of the morning procession that slow and stately glide through corridors lined with bowing bodies, where every step was a performance and every glance a political act. This was different. This was the movement of a man who had remembered, somewhere beneath the layers of protocol and powder and divine appointment, that he had a body, a real one, with muscle and breath and the particular aliveness that only announces itself when it is being used. He rode well. He had always ridden well. It was one of the few things Louis did that required no attendant to complete, no nobleman to hand him the necessary piece of it, no ceremony to make it legitimate. You either rode or you did not, and Louis XIV rode the way some men pray, with his whole self, and with something close to relief. The hunt was officially many things. It was a demonstration of royal vigour. It was a tradition older than Versailles, older than the dynasty, stretching back through centuries of French kings who had pursued deer through these same forests with the same mixture of genuine pleasure and deliberate symbolism. It was an opportunity for certain favoured courtiers to ride alongside the king, close enough to speak to him informally, which made it one of the most coveted social occasions the calendar offered. Men angled for invitations to the hunt the way they angled for everything at Versailles, with patience, with strategy, with a willingness to wait years for the right moment. But underneath all of that, underneath the symbolism and the politics and the careful choreography of who rode where and who was close enough to catch the king's ear, underneath all of it, the hunt was the 1 hour of Louis's day that still belonged, in some essential and unspoken way, to him. In the forest, the watching softened. The eyes were still there. They were always there, but the trees interrupted the sightlines, and the horses created noise and distance, and the animal urgency of the chase dissolved briefly and mercifully some of the careful architecture of observation that structured every other moment of his existence. He could move faster than a courtier could follow. He could turn his face away from everyone and look only at what was ahead of him, which was just trees and light and the sound of hounds and the cold, particular smell of a French forest in the afternoon. A smell that had nothing to do with beeswax or powder or the accumulated perfume of hundreds of people standing in enclosed spaces. There is something quietly heartbreaking about a man who must ride into a forest to find a moment of his own, and who cannot even fully find it there, because the forest too has been mapped and managed and populated with people whose purpose is to be near him. A gamekeeper named Renard, who worked those forests for 30 years and left behind a handful of letters to his brother in Lyon, wrote once that he had seen the king pause at the edge of a clearing, entirely still, while the hunt moved on ahead without him, just for a moment, just long enough to look up through the canopy at the sky, which was doing nothing significant, which was simply being sky, grey and enormous and indifferent to kings. Then Louis had touched his heels to his horse and ridden forward back into the noise, back into the company, back into the long afternoon that still had many hours and many ceremonies left inside it. It weighed, depending on the occasion, somewhere between 2 and 4 pounds. That is the weight of a large dictionary, the weight of a sleeping cat, the weight of something you might carry comfortably for 10 minutes and then begin, with increasing awareness, to feel across your shoulders and down the back of your neck for the rest of the afternoon. Louis XIV wore his wig for the entirety of his public day, which was the entirety of his public day, which was the entirety of his day, because at Versailles there was no private portion of daylight hours in which the king might be allowed to simply be a man with his own hair, or in his later years without it. The wig went on in the morning as part of the ceremony of dressing, placed with both hands by a designated individual whose role this was and had always been, and it came off only at the very end of the night, in the ceremony of the coucher, the ritualized going to bed that mirrored the morning's lever with the perfect symmetry of a world that could not tolerate an unwitnessed moment. Louis had begun losing his hair in his late 20s. This is in the long catalogue of things that happen to human beings, entirely unremarkable. Men lose their hair. They have always lost their hair. They adapt to this with varying degrees of grace and self-consciousness and quiet renegotiation of their reflection, and then they continue, hair or no hair, being themselves. This is what ordinary men do because ordinary men have no other option. Louis XIV had a different option. Louis XIV was the King of France. And so instead of adapting to his hair loss, he simply extended the definition of hair to include something larger and more magnificent than hair had any right to be. The first wigs appeared at court as a personal choice and became, with the particular velocity that royal preferences achieve when everyone around them is watching for signals, a social requirement within years. If the king wore a wig, then wearing a wig was correct, and if wearing a wig was correct, then not wearing one required an explanation that most men preferred not to have to give. By the time the fashion had fully taken hold, the wig-makers of Paris had become some of the most important craftsmen in France, their workshops producing elaborate constructions of human and horsehair that cascaded past the shoulders in dark or powdered waves, frames for the face that transformed mere noblemen into something grander than they actually were, which was, of course, precisely the point. The wig was never really about hair. It was about the distance between what a man was and what he needed to appear to be, and the wig closed that distance in a way that was visible from across a very large room. It was architecture in the most personal sense, a structure built not from stone but from vanity and politics and the peculiarly human need to be seen as more than biology has made you. Louis understood this with an instinct so natural it barely required thought. He had been performing kingship since the age of 4. He knew in his bones that what people saw was what they believed, and what they believed was what was real, and therefore controlling what people saw was the most important exercise of power available to him. The wig said, "I am not merely a man whose hair is thinning. I am a concept. I am an institution. I am something that does not age the way bodies age or diminish the way ordinary things diminish. I am the Sun King, and the sun does not go bald." A wig-maker named Christophe, who supplied the court for 20 years and kept meticulous records of every piece he produced, noted in his ledger beside one particularly large ceremonial wig the single annotation, "pour paraître," to appear. He meant it as a description of its purpose. He could not have known he was writing, in 2 small words, the entire philosophy of Versailles. Louis put on the wig every morning and became again the thing he had decided to be. And the court looked up at him and saw it, and believed it, and that belief was the foundation on which everything else was carefully, perpetually, and exhaustingly built. By the time evening arrived at Versailles, the palace had been performing for 12 hours, the candles had been burning since before dawn, the fires had been tended and retended, the floors had absorbed the weight of thousands of footsteps moving in their prescribed directions along their prescribed routes, and the air inside the great rooms had thickened with the accumulated warmth of bodies and beeswax and the particular exhaustion of people who had been watched all day and had been watched all day and had been watched all day and could not yet go home because the thick day was not finished, because the king had not yet eaten dinner, and dinner at Versailles was not a meal. It was a statement. The grand cover, the formal evening meal, was a statement. The grand cover, the formal evening meal, held several times each week in full view of anyone who had been granted admission, which was many people, which was sometimes hundreds of people, was perhaps the purest expression of everything Louis XIV had spent his reign constructing. Here was power made edible. Here was hierarchy served in courses. The table was set with a precision that a mathematician would have admired. Every piece of silver and crystal placed according to our earless that had been written down and revised and debated by men whose entire professional lives were devoted to the correct placement of objects on a royal table. The centerpieces were architectural. The napkins were folded into shapes that took trained hands considerable time to produce and would be destroyed in moments. Everything that could be gilded had been gilded. Everything that could be made to catch the candlelight had been positioned to catch it perfectly. And into this arrived the food. Cold. It was always cold. It could not be otherwise. The kitchens at Versailles were built at a considerable distance from the royal apartments. Fire was a danger, and smoke was an offence, and the smell of cooking was apparently incompatible with the dignity of the spaces closest to the king. And so the food travelled. It travelled through corridors that were long and draughty and entirely indifferent to the temperature of what passed through them. carried by processions of servants moving with the careful urgency of people who understood that arriving slowly was a failing, but arriving spilled was unthinkable. By the time the roasted birds and the elaborate ragouts and the towering sugar sculptures completed their long cold journey and were placed before Louis with the ceremony of offerings laid before a god, they were what they were, which was magnificent and lukewarm and entirely unavoidable. Louis ate without complaint. He had, by all accounts, a digestive constitution that his physicians regarded with something between admiration and scientific bafflement. He ate quantities that would have distressed a lesser stomach, ate them cold, ate them slowly and completely, while hundreds of eyes catalogued every bite with the diligence of scholars recording a primary source. Foreign visitors wrote home about it. Ambassadors included descriptions of the royal dinner in their affiche. Aisle dispatches as though the fact of a king eating was itself geopolitically significant, which at Versailles, in a way that made a strange kind of sense, it actually was, because every person standing in that room had made a calculation. They had weighed the cold apartments and the surrendered estates and the endless corridors and the years of waiting for a glance. They had weighed all of it against this, against the ability to write in a letter or say at a table somewhere that they had stood in the room where Louis XIV dined, that they had seen his hands, that they had been close enough to the centre of the world to feel its gravity. A young nobleman from Brittany named Gilles, attending the Grand Couvert for the first time at the age of 19, wrote to his mother that he had stood for 2 hours without moving, without speaking, barely breathing, watching the king eat soup. He wrote that it was the greatest evening of his life. He meant it completely, with his whole young heart, and there is something in that, something tender and terrible and very, very human that the cold soup and the gilded table and the hundreds of watching eyes could not diminish, no matter how strange the room that contained it. The candles burned lower, the courses came and went, and Louis ate on alone at his magnificent table, in the particular silence of a man who has never once had to ask for anything, and has therefore never quite learned how. He would not have said so. There was no mechanism at Versailles for a king to say so, no ritual slot in the day's long programme where Louis XIV might turn to the assembled court and admit, quietly and without theatre, that his feet ached and his shoulders carried the particular heaviness of a man who had been performing since before dawn and would like more than anything to simply stop. The words did not exist in the language Versailles. Constructed for itself. Fatigue was a private thing, and at Versailles nothing was private. And so the tiredness lived where it always lived, behind the eyes, in the set of the jaw, in the almost imperceptible slowing of a man who had been many things today, and was now, in the final hours, running low on the energy required to be all of them simultaneously. The coucher began. It was the mirror of the morning, the lever reflected in evening's quieter light, and it followed the same logic of witnessed intimacy that had governed every hour between. The court reassembled, not quite as fully as the morning, the numbers thinned by the late hour and the particular hierarchy of who was permitted to attend the bedtime ritual versus who was only welcome for the earlier entertainments, but assembled nonetheless, because the day at Versailles did not end until Louis was horizontal and the candles beside his bed had been extinguished by the designated hands of the designated person, whose family had extinguished those candles for longer than anyone could comfortably remember. The wig came off first. There is something in this moment, something unscripted in a day built entirely from script, that feels almost tender if you let yourself look at it directly. The elaborate construction of hair and wire and careful illusion was lifted away, and underneath it was simply a man, an aging man by his later years, with the bare and unadorned head of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. The face that remained when the wig was gone was the same face that had looked out from 10,000 portraits, but quieter somehow, reduced to something more human than the portraits ever managed to capture, a face that belonged to a person rather than a symbol. The coat was removed. The waistcoat. Each layer of the day's magnificent construction was carefully disassembled, by the hands that had constructed it that morning, and there is a strange and melancholy poetry in that symmetry. that the same ceremony which built a king at dawn should spend the evening hours gently taking him apart. A nobleman named Edouard, who attended the coucher regularly in Louis's later years and wrote about it with an honesty unusual for the time, noted that the king's hands, once the gloves were removed, were the hands of an old man, spotted, slightly swollen at the knuckles, the hands of someone who had lived inside a body for a very long time and could not, regardless of ceremony, entirely conceal the evidence of it. Louis said his prayers. This, too, was witnessed. The kneeling and the murmuring and the brief, bowed head, witnessed with the same solemn attention that had been given to every other act of the day, because at Versailles, even a man's conversation with God was a semi-public event. Then the nightshirt passed through the appropriate hands in the appropriate order. Then the bed, turned back by attendants whose role this was and had always been. Then the moment, the final moment of the public day, when Louis XIV lay down inside the great carved bed and the curtains were drawn closed around him. The courtiers bowed to the curtains. This was correct. This was required. They bowed to the closed curtains of a bed containing a tired old man, and they meant it, and they filed out quietly into the corridor, and the candles were extinguished one by one until only one remained, burning low on a table near the door, kept by a single attendant who would sit in the dimness all night in case the king required something, in case the Sun King, even in sleep, needed a witness. The palace settled into a quiet that was never quite silence, full of the small sounds of thousands of thousands of thousands of people breathing in their borrowed rooms. And outside, in the dark gardens, the air, fountains had been stilled for the night, and the water lay flat and black, and perfectly, finally still. Not because his death was violent or sudden, it was neither. It was slow, and it was watched. And it was watched, in the way that everything in his life had been slow and watched, and it unfolded over several weeks with the same ceremonial inevitability that had characterized every other significant event of his 77 years. Gangrene had taken his leg, moving upward with a patience that his physicians could observe and record and argue about but could not stop. And Louis bore it with a composure that those present described afterward, with a reverence that had not entirely dimmed by the time their own deaths came for them. He received visitors from his bed, he gave audiences, he issued instructions, he remained, until very nearly the end, the Sun King, not because the performance was required of him any longer, not because the ritual demanded it, but because after 72 years of inhabiting that particular shape, he may no longer have been entirely certain where the performance ended and the person began. He had been king since the age of 4. Let that settle for a moment, the way a stone settles into still water, slowly and completely. He had been king since the age of 4, which means that every memory Louis XIV possessed of being a conscious, thinking, feeling human being was also a memory of being a king. There was no version of himself that existed before the crown, no private Louis tucked away somewhere beneath the ceremony who remembered what it felt like to be simply a child in a room, unobserved, unattended, belonging entirely to himself. That person, if he had ever existed, had been absorbed so early and so completely into the institution of kinship that no trace of the separation remained. He was not a man who wore a crown. He was a crown that had, for practical purposes, taken the shape of a man. And yet, there are small things in the historical record, small, quiet, easily overlooked things, but suggest something more complicated, moving beneath the surface of all that composed and gilded certainty. The moment in the forest that Renard the gamekeeper witnessed, the king alone at the edge of a clearing, looking up at a sky that asked nothing of him. The cold food eaten without complaint for decades, the hands that Edouard noticed at the coucher, old and swollen and entirely irreducibly human beneath the removed gloves. The single line that Philippe the understeward wrote in his diary about a man utterly alone in a room full of love, looking at nothing, looking down, never looking up. These details do not change the history. The history is what it is. enormous and gilded and almost impossible to hold in the mind all at once. 72 years of reign, a palace that remade the idea of what a palace could be, a system of power so elegant it barely needed to announce itself, a life so thoroughly witnessed that almost every hour of it was recorded by someone standing nearby with ink and paper and the solemn conviction that what they were watching mattered. It did matter. It matters still, in the way that all human things matter, not because they were grand, though this one was extraordinarily grand, but because somewhere inside the grandeur was a person, navigating the specific loneliness of a life that had been shaped entirely by forces larger than any individual could comfortably contain. The candles burned down, as candles do. The courtiers who had devoted their lives to proximity eventually followed him one by one into an absence that no ceremony could structure. The palace remains still, if you want to go and walk its corridors and stand in the hall of mirrors and look at your own reflection multiplied into infinity, which is a strange and quietly vertiginous experience that Louis himself must have had and never recorded his feelings about. Outside, tonight, wherever you are, it is quiet now. The fountains at Versailles have been stilled for 300 years, and the king is gone, and the ceremony is over, and what remains is only this: the faint and flickering sense of a life fully lived inside its own constraints, pressing gently against them in the dark, in small moments that no one was supposed to notice, that almost no one did. Sleep well. You have travelled a very long way tonight, and you have arrived here gently, just as you were always meant to.